So what are the institutions associated with climate change? We've covered what the IPCC has stated as far as the physical and biological effects of global climate change, and we'll talk about what are the countries done or not done in that case to mitigate, or that is to minimize, future global climate change. So a lot of dates. We recognize the IPCC was set up by the UN, and it's given 4 assessment reports over the years, each with increasing certainty and severity of climate change and human contribution. Now, inside of that, we have the political wrangling that goes on with the Kyoto Protocol, the meetings of the parties, and the conference of the parties to decide what the countries are going to do about it. It's worth noting the IPCC conducts no research itself, but just reports on peer-reviewed literature. And it should be policy neutral, if human beings can be policy neutral. And so what we see over the years is an increasing certainty from beginning in 1990, just a broad overview of what climate change is and what evidence there is for warming, to a certainty of 66%, to a certainty of 90% that global climate change is a result of increases in greenhouse gases from human activities, and that warming itself is unequivocal. This wording unequivocal created quite a stir in the scientific community, as many people say there's no such thing as unequivocal. Please read over these findings in the reports, and in particular, they reference the hockey stick graph. This is the hockey stick graph that shows temperature anomalies as a function of the year, and all of these different scans are different reports of what the global temperature should be, but they all do converge with the same understanding that the temperature is increasing at a very high rate and with an extreme that is unprecedented in the last 1,000 years. This report of 1 to 6 degrees Celsius increase and 18 centimeters to 59 centimeters of sea rise should be thought of as very conservative because they didn't include water loss from the Greenland ice sheet. And although we like to say this is non-political, contributions from different oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia saying there is no global climate change, there's also a commitment to increased global climate change, increased temperature rise. What does it mean to be committed to? Well, physically, the Earth hasn't finished warming up because there's a lot of water. Water takes a long time to warm up. So even if we stopped emitting CO2 at this point and the CO2 levels remain constant, there still would be continued temperature rise and increased climate change. The climate models also predict these physical consequences. They disagree on how soon and how severe, but they all do agree that this is happening. But it was the royal economist Nicholas Stern's report that got the attention of the public, because he said climate change is going to hurt us in the wallet. It's going to cost us money. And the 2 important findings were that we could mitigate the worst amount of climate change and it would cost us about 1% of our GDP. However, failure to do this will cost us between 5 and 20% of our GDP every year. However, there is also reason to think that a transition to a carbonless society would result in economic gain. There are many arguments that support this statement that we can gain economically by reducing our carbon emissions. The most basic of this is increased efficiency will reduce our carbon emissions, but will also decrease our need for energy and thereby save us money and improve the economy. The Conference of the Parties is a meeting that happens every year where delegates from all countries argue about what measures should be taken. The very first was Rio de Janeiro, where they agreed they should do something. They waited 2 years and then began Conference of the Parties. And so the third Conference of the Party, the Kyoto Protocol, was established that established required and enforceable reductions in greenhouse emissions. Clinton greatly backed this, but recognized that in the Republican Senate it was not going to pass, so he didn't put it up for vote. Later, the Bush administration rejected it. The sticking point for the Bush administration was China, because countries were separated into 2 categories. Annex 1 and 2 countries are the rich and developed countries. They emit much more carbon per person. However, they are very stable in that they're not increasing their emissions very quickly, versus developing countries that have very low emissions per person. The Kyoto Protocol called for the Annex 1 and 2 countries to cap or reduce their emissions, while developing countries were allowed to continue to increase. And the Bush administration said that China should not be in this category, that China itself was a developed country and should be included in the Annex 1 and Annex 2. China responded by saying, we will reduce our carbon intensity, meaning the economy will grow at a greater rate than our carbon emissions, but our carbon emissions are going to go up. The Kyoto Protocol set up a flexibility through the carbon cap and trade and the clean development mechanism. What these recognize is that for different areas, cost of carbon reduction is different. And so what carbon cap and trade could do is, rather than my company reducing its emissions, I could pay another company to reduce their emissions for me. Furthermore, through a clean development mechanism, an Annex 1 or 2 country could help a developed country develop in a clean way and thereby save the carbon credits for themselves. So, for instance, if the United States helped India develop a solar farm for electricity rather than develop a coal-powered generation facility, the saved carbon could be used by the United States to increase their emissions somewhat. When the Conference of the Parties have a big meeting, they call it a meeting of the parties. So there's only been 5 meetings of the parties over these years. The most recent one was in Durban, South Africa, and in 2012 we have one in Qatar. Copenhagen was the one they had right after Obama's election in Copenhagen. You might have heard that. For peaceful protests, rather than assassinate someone they don't like, they hit them in the face with a pie. And so, under the Bush administration, that the U.S. flat out rejected the Kyoto Protocol, and we see the U.S. negotiator got one in the face. In Bali 2007, we see a very angry Al Gore pointing his finger at his own country, saying, "Why have we obstructed this process?" Al Gore recognizes the importance of us reducing our carbon footprint. Unfortunately, not enough to reduce his own. He's well known for an extravagant lifestyle that's very high in carbon. And other countries asking the United States, would you just get out of the way and let us move forward with climate change policy? And so what we see is the United States is the only country that signed and then rejected the Kyoto Protocol. This is a map of the countries and their commitment to reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. What you see is very few countries are committed to reduce carbon dioxide emissions because they rejected the Kyoto Protocol or because they're developing countries and are not required to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Since this graph was made, Canada, with the new conservative government, has actually pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol, so they're also red. It's widely accepted that the Kyoto Protocol has fallen apart. Most people blame the United States for their lack of participation, their lack of leadership, and their rejection of the Kyoto Protocol. However, many European countries, and Japan for instance, remain committed to their reduction, and they're right on track for reducing their carbon emissions as they had originally projected. So what has happened? The EPA has declared carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to be pollutants. This has caused a backlash from some people like Will Happer, a physicist who speaks out on energy policy, say this is ridiculous that we would call it a pollutant. However, this is largely a policy measure which allows the EPA to regulate it. And the philosophy is, while you may not die from small amounts of inhalation of CO2, it is adversely affecting the human condition. We look at what's happened in California. AB 32 was passed in 2006, and this is a greenhouse gas reduction bill where we will reduce our emissions to the 1990 level by 2020, which represents a 25% decrease from business as usual. It's worth noting that the governor at the time, Arnold Schwarzenegger, fought this bill tooth and nail until he was forced to accept it. He turned around and said, we have the muscle, the debate is over, there's climate change, we work together, the Republicans and the Democrats. And he said, Bush is late to the post-party party, he's missing it. And he made a very bold gesture in that California made policy with Northeast U.S. and Tony Blair from the United Kingdom, essentially stepping over George Bush in Washington, D.C. Why did Dan Kammen say, if any of this still matters in 2020, then we failed? Well, because we're only California. This was meant to be the beginning point for the United States and for the world, and to a degree it's happening. So what AB 32 was just a bunch of politicians saying we are going to commit to this level of reduction. They had no idea how we were going to do it. And so what AB 32 was, it empowered CARB, the California Air Resources Board, to figure out how you were going to achieve these emissions. And so we'll talk about some of the means by which we achieve these emissions. Title 24, for instance, is a command and control that says that you can't build new buildings or renovations unless they're energy efficient. We also have a renewable portfolio standard where a certain percentage of our electricity has to come from renewable sources. And I believe that's 20% by the year 2020. So let's talk about command and control versus market-based mechanisms. Command and control are simply that. The government passes laws that are going to force people to reduce their emissions versus market-based mechanisms, which allow people to do whatever they want, but they impose a larger cost on unwanted behavior. And so this is essentially internalizing the external costs of climate change. So command and control measures are Title 24, which we mentioned before, whereby if you sell or do renovations to your house, you have to have low E glass, you have to have good insulation. Energy Star, if you want to sell a refrigerator in this state, it's going to be very efficient. And restrictions on, for instance, incandescent light bulbs or other practices that result in large emissions. Both a carbon cap and trade and a carbon tax or environmental tax, they're both market-based, meaning you allow the consumer to do what they want, but you invoke a tax whereby they'll be forced to pay a higher cost for the decisions that result in increased emissions. Cap and trade is where we say as a community we are going to cap our carbon emissions, we are not going to increase them. However, between different companies, if one company can reduce its carbon emissions easier than another, the two companies can negotiate a way to make that happen. The clean development mechanism is essentially a trade between developed and undeveloped countries that allow clean development in a poor country, whereby the developed country that helps them retains some of the rights to emit more carbon. So let's talk about environmental tax shifting. So what about a carbon tax? When we look at the role of taxes, there's two purposes. One, to generate revenue, and two, to disincentivize things that we don't like. And it's interesting that in capitalism, we should want to make money, but we shouldn't want to waste. So it seems counterproductive that we tax income and we subsidize extraction and consumption through our energy and water policies. So the proposal is that every commodity sold in the US will receive an environmental index number indicating the life cycle environmental impact of this substance, and we'll tax it accordingly. For example, if we taxed carbon dioxide emissions at $150 a ton, that would correspond to $1.50 per gallon increase. It would double the cost of natural gas use and the associated electricity and triple the cost for coal electricity. And so you mentioned the word tax, and it's a political stopper. No one will do it. But this does not have to be another tax. It can be a different tax in that. So if every year this tax would increase and we'd have a 10% reduction in income taxes, we're just shifting our tax base from taxing income to taxing environmental consequences. The economists should like this because it allows the consumer or the buyer to bear the full cost of their decision by internalizing these external costs. The net effect would be to lower energy use and emissions. So lastly, Lester Brown, you can read about him if you like, is a champion of this idea. It's not gaining a lot of traction. Initially, Barack Obama talked about cap and trade. In my opinion, it opens up a whole new carbon market, like a whole new stock market, with all kinds of opportunities for fraud and cheating. And this is a reason I don't like it, and potentially this is a reason why the politicians like it, because companies could readily find a way around having to pay for their emissions. Where if you tax coal and oil directly when you pull it out of the ground, it's very simple. So compared to a carbon cap and trade, environmental tax restructuring is much simpler to invoke and could be implemented much more effectively. We talked about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a scientific body that describes what's going on. And we talked about the Conference of the Parties and the Meetings of the Parties, which is a political body that has been wrangling about what we're going to do about this problem. Opportunity.